let's go to Lambert. Lambert, Ethiopia announced this recently last week, I think beginning of last week, if I'm not mistaken. It could have announced it during, the foreign ministers meeting, the foreign ministers of BRICS meeting beginning of June, where most of the countries that announced who wants to join BRICS, but it chose specifically this time. And on the same day, we also have heard or read from the U.S. government with its own media outlet saying that it has revoked the Ethiopia's the human rights violation designation on Ethiopia, which is almost hard. It's very hard to say this is a coincidence. Now, what is your view on this? Let's talk about maybe from the U.S., from both sides. I mean, there seems to be a motive, a deliberate action for choosing this time. How do you view this? Let's start with Ethiopia.
Mahlet, thank you for that question. And then, of course, Kwame has responded to the potential of Ethiopia in regard to its potential to join the BRICS. But nothing is a coincidence in politics. It cannot be a coincidence that Ethiopia announced its intention to join the BRICS, and at the same time, the U.S. announced that it was revoking its human rights designation. Of course, it comes with many connotations. Number one, what was the purpose of designating Ethiopia as a country where there are human rights abuses in the first instance? Then how come that they are removing it now at this point? One of the things that came to my mind, the same moment I saw the US saying it had removed the designation, the moment Ethiopia announced that it was joining the BRICS, everybody was speaking of this to be a reaction by the US to Ethiopia announcing it's joining the BRICS. Of course, most people see the BRICS as an alternative to NATO. So the impression, which for me began from actually Western media, was that the US was trying to lure back Ethiopia and say, come on, don't join the BRICS because it may not serve their interests, since the BRICS seems to be seen as an opponent, or we would say an alternative to NATO. Now, that is easy to think, and of course, it could be true. But I'm thinking, when something seems so obvious, then sometimes you go to ask yourself that, is it really that obvious? Because in any case, while of course the West and of course the US particularly wouldn't want or wouldn't be so happy for major powers in Africa like Ethiopia to join, a rival alliance like the BRICS, I don't think it's enough reason to cause the US to lift their human rights designation on Ethiopia. So I'm thinking, perhaps this is what they want us to think. Now, this is a perspective very few people have seen. Perhaps this is what the US wants us to think. Perhaps this is what the government of Ethiopia itself, I'm sure Ethiopians may not buy this opinion so popularly, and maybe those who are in government, because then we are thinking in the boardroom and not taking what they're giving us. But also, I could be wrong, of course. But I'm thinking, maybe this is what the government of Ethiopia wants us to think, that they have lifted the human rights designation because they were trying to join the BRICS. Maybe what the US government wants us to think is that they lifted the human rights designation on Ethiopia because Ethiopia was joining the BRICS. Now, that is almost the pattern you are going to conclude. And that's exactly what about 90, maybe even 100% of people concluded. And people were debating, yes, you see, when we choose to join the BRICS, now you are lifting this. And they had set the narrative. They had set the kind of debate they wanted. We were now debating the merits and demerits of the US responding to Ethiopia joining the BRICS. But my personal opinion, coming from a point of suspicion, was that for the US to lift that designation on Ethiopia, it could only come based on something much bigger. I know that Ethiopia has been, like any other government that is recovering from war, a war where the US was said to have been partly involved. We know that the US has been a significant player in the conflict in Ethiopia. And I know, everybody knows, that the government of Ethiopia has been having negotiations. You can call them negotiations or talks with the US. You know, over time, the human rights designation meant that the Ethiopia was no longer eligible for some kind of grants and help and aid from the US. And I know that given the post-war time, Ethiopia is rebuilding, and I know that it's in the interest of the government of Ethiopia, it's in the interest of the Prime Minister of Ethiopia to rebuild relationships with the West, because, well, you can't exist as an island, and the fact is that the US has been a major aid giver to Ethiopia. So it's obvious any government in Ethiopia would want some kind of good relationship, especially now that the war is over. But I know that politics is about a give and take. What are you putting on the table? What are we taking? So what did it be? And for me, that's the first principle of negotiation or relationships within countries, especially countries that deal in interests, like the US. The US is an interest state. You know, they have no friends. They deal on the basis of interests. What do you have on the table? And this is what we give. So under those circumstances, I'm thinking, would the US just react to Ethiopia joining BRICS by doing something, removing, you could say, a chain that they have always tied on Ethiopia's legs, simply because it is joining BRICS? If anything, BRICS is just beginning. It may pose a threat in the long term, and I think that BRICS offers benefits which are not immediate so much. So I imagine the US could still play a delay game even if Ethiopia joined BRICS. I don't think it is something that would cause the US to lift these sanctions. Because for me, the sanctions have been one way of the US policing and keeping the government of Ethiopia in check. Now, with all these suspicions in my mind, I'm thinking, what then could have caused them to lift the sanctions? And that is the discussion the people in Africa and everywhere should have been involved in the moment those sanctions were lifted. But then I'm thinking, maybe that's the discussion that the US did not want people to be involved in. Maybe that's the discussion that the government of Ethiopia did not want people to be involved in, asking why have they lifted the sanctions. By the way, I say this not because I think the sanctions were justified. Of course, they were not. I'm totally against sanctions. What I'm discussing here is the basis for lifting them, not their justification. So I'm thinking the US and the government of Ethiopia could not have wanted us to discuss the reasons behind the lifting of the sanctions. And if they didn't want us to discuss the reasons behind the lifting of the sanctions, then it must be that it involved concessions between the US to the government of Ethiopia and concessions from the government of Ethiopia to the US, which they don't believe might be something that is music to the ear to the common people in Ethiopia or to Africa as a continent. So to avoid that kind of discussion, they had to give a diversion. And the issue of BRICS for me came in as that diversion. So you join BRICS, we shall lift these sanctions, and everybody will be talking and saying they have lifted them because you have joined the BRICS. And therefore nobody is thinking critically and looking at the other potential reasons. So we can discuss either today or another day the possible reasons why the sanctions may have been lifted, which would mean that I would go in detail and discuss the possible concessions. I began by saying that the US operates on interests. What has Ethiopia accepted to do? What has the government of Ethiopia, what concessions has the government made to the US to cause them to lift these sanctions? Because these sanctions in Ethiopia, like in any other part of the world, is the only weapon the US oftentimes has against governments. They use it to cripple you. They use it to hold you back. They've done it in Zimbabwe. They've done it in so many other countries to hold them back. And Ethiopia has been one of the victims. Take the example of Eritrea. Eritrea is still under sanctions from the US. Yes? Are you telling me today, because Eritrea and Ethiopia are all at the Horn of Africa, and I'm so sure that the US would want to have relationships with both Ethiopia and Eritrea. If Eritrea chose today to join the BRICS, would the US lift its sanctions? I mean, if you want to think at the most basic level. So I'm thinking it can't be simply because Ethiopia has joined the BRICS. I think in my suspicious mind that the government of Ethiopia has made some significant concessions to the government of the US. What are those concessions? Perhaps that's a discussion for another day. But they must be big enough to warrant the US and convince the government in Washington to finally lift those sanctions. I mean, lift those sanctions from Ethiopia. So the timing, it isn't a coincidence. I think it was something that is planned, most likely between both governments.
A very interesting perspective that you have brought to us. So with that, it's not only the US, but also Ethiopia's timing is just like the US want us, to forget the justification why in the first place that it has put that designation on Ethiopia. Ethiopia also, or the Ethiopian government wants us to think, oh, because of this, now the US is lifting the sanction for us not to talk about this possible or potential concessions that the two governments have made behind the scene.